The combine stopped. Not slowly, not with a cough or a sputter. It just stopped, dead, in the middle of a field that hadn't seen a decent harvest in 3 years. It was October of 1983, and the air in Saline County, Missouri smelled like rust, dry clay, and something older, something you can only call desperation. The kind of desperation that gets into a man's lungs and stays there. Harlan Oak stood on the running board of his 1961 Oliver 880, one boot on the iron step, one hand gripping the steering wheel like it was the last solid thing in his world. Because in a way it was. 42 acres of hardpan dirt stretched out in front of him, cracked like old pottery. Behind him, a crowd of about 30 neighbors had gathered along the fence line, some leaning on truck hoods, some with their arms crossed, most of them just watching, waiting. And across the fence, in a pickup truck so clean it looked like it had never touched a gravel road, sat a man named Dale Whitmore, and he was laughing. Remember that moment, we're going to come back to it. Let me tell you about Saline County, Missouri in the autumn of 1983. Sit with it for just a moment. Saline County sits in the west-central part of the state, not far from the Missouri River. It's a place where the land rolls gently, not the dramatic hills of the Ozarks, not the flat monotony of the true plains, but something in between, something honest. The soil there at its best is a rich, dark Putnam silt loam, the kind of soil that made central Missouri one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country through the mid-20th century. Farmers there raised corn, soybeans, wheat, and hogs. They'd been doing it since the 1820s. It was a county built on the idea that if you worked hard enough, the land would work with you. But 1983 was not a kind year. It wasn't a kind decade, really. The farm crisis of the 1980s is one of the great untold tragedies of American rural life. By 1983, interest rates that had ballooned to nearly 21% just 2 years earlier were still crippling. Land values that had soared through the 1970s were now in freefall. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land prices to buy equipment and expand their operations were being crushed by debt. Between 1981 and 1986, more than 300,000 American farms would go under. The USDA called it the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression. In Saline County, you could feel it in the air like a change in weather. You could see it in the empty chairs at the Marshall Diner on Tuesday mornings, where farmers used to drink bad coffee and talk seed prices. You could see it in the auction signs staked along Highway 65, the words farm sale printed in red letters that flapped in the October wind like distress flags. That wind in October in Saline County, let me tell you about that wind. It comes in from the northwest and it has an edge to it. Not the bitter, bone-cracking cold of January, but something more insidious. A damp, penetrating chill that gets inside your collar and reminds you that winter is patient and it's coming whether you're ready or not. The cottonwood trees along Blackwater Creek had already started to let go of their leaves, and they came down in slow, spinning circles, landing in the cracked furrows of fields that should have been producing 2 or 3 times what they were. This was the world Harlan Oaks woke up to every single morning. Let me tell you about Harlan Oaks. Harlan was 51 years old in 1983. He was not a tall man, maybe 5'9" in his work boots, but he was built the way working men are built. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of the same hardwood he used to patch fence posts. His face was weathered in that particular way that only comes from decades of being outdoors, not just tan but layered. Sun and wind and cold and time, all pressed into the same skin. He had been farming the same 280 acres his grandfather had broken with a team of mules back in 1911. 3 generations. The Oaks farm sat on a modest rise about 4 miles south of the town of Marshall, and it had been a good farm, a reliable farm, for most of its life. Harlan had graduated from Marshall High School in 1950, spent 2 years in the Army during the Korean conflict, saw things he didn't talk about at the dinner table, and come home in 1952 to work alongside his father. He married a woman named Ruth Ellen Mayers in 1955, a Marshall girl whose family had farmed the bottomland along the Missouri River for generations. They raised 3 children. They never took a vacation that lasted more than 4 days. Harlan was not the kind of man who complained. That's important to understand. He wasn't a bitter man, and he wasn't a prideful man in the way that causes trouble. He was something rarer, a man who was quiet in his confidence. He knew what he knew, and he didn't feel the need to announce it. But what he knew by 1983 was this. The south 40 of his farm, 42 acres of what he called the creek ground, land that had once been the most productive soil on the property, was dying. Not dying in the dramatic, sudden way of a flood or a fire, dying slowly. The topsoil, which his grandfather had described as being 18 inches deep and black as midnight, had been compacted and eroded and depleted over decades of conventional tillage. The drainage had failed. The organic matter was nearly gone, and 3 consecutive dry years had turned that once rich ground into something that looked, and in some ways behaved, like clay tile. His neighbors told him to give it up. The ag extension agent from the University of Missouri told him it would take 10 years and a lot of money to remediate it conventionally. His banker told him he was already behind on his operating loan. And Dale Whitmore told him to sell. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever met a man who wears his money like a cologne, who enters a room and immediately starts measuring how much more he has than everyone else in it? Dale Whitmore was that man. Dale was 44 years old in 1983, and he had done very well for himself, though the way he'd done well was a matter of some debate in Saline County. His father, Roy Whitmore, had operated the John Deere dealership in Marshall for 30 years. When Roy died in 1971, Dale inherited the dealership, a healthy line of credit, and none of his father's humility. By 1983, Dale had leveraged that dealership into something considerably larger. He had purchased, at distressed prices during the crisis years, nearly 600 acres of Saline County farmland from farmers who couldn't hold on any longer. He didn't farm it himself, not really. He cash rented most of it back to younger operators who worked it on his terms. He sat in his office at the John Deere dealership on East Arrow Street, with its big plate glass windows and its row of gleaming green machines lined up out front, and he managed his holdings the way a man manages a portfolio. He drove a 1983 Chevrolet Silverado, dark green, that was washed every Saturday morning. He wore Wranglers that had never seen actual field work. He had a handshake that was one pump too short, the kind of handshake that tells you the man has already decided you're beneath him before your palms even meet. He was not evil in the Hollywood sense. He didn't twirl a mustache. He was something more ordinary and more recognizable than that. He was a man who had decided that the farmers around him were failing not because of interest rates or drought or soil depletion, but because they were inferior, less smart, less modern, less willing to adapt. And this belief made him cruel in the particular way that self-righteous people are cruel, casually, without even noticing. When Harlan's neighbor, a man named Cal Bergmeyer, lost his 180-acre farm in the spring of 1983, Dale was at the auction. He bought the whole parcel for $385 an acre, less than a third of what it had been worth 6 years earlier. He didn't shake Cal's hand afterward. He just had his accountant file the paperwork. And by the summer of 1983, Dale had his eye on the Oaks farm. Specifically, he wanted that South 40, the creek ground, because even degraded, that bottomland acreage had value if you had the capital to remediate it properly. He had started showing up, not in any overt, threatening way. He'd drive past the field when Harlan was working. He'd stop at the co-op in Marshall when he knew Harlan would be there picking up supplies. He'd make remarks. Quiet ones, almost friendly, like a man sharing an observation about the weather. That south piece of yours isn't looking good, Harlan. You know, I can take that off your hands before it costs you any more. A man ought to know when he's fighting a losing battle. That last one? Harlan heard that one in August of 1983 at the grain elevator on Highway 240. He heard it and he nodded politely and he drove home. And that evening, he walked out to the barn and spent 3 hours looking at something he'd been thinking about for a long time. The thing you have to understand about small-town agricultural communities in 1983 is that information traveled fast, but equipment traveled faster. When a man fired up a machine, especially an unusual one, especially on ground that everyone agreed was too far gone to bother with, people noticed. It was a Saturday morning in early October when Harlan Oaks pulled his 1961 Oliver 880-row crop tractor out of the machine shed and hitched it to a piece of equipment that most of the men in Saline County hadn't seen in 15 years. Word got around the way word does. By 9 in the morning, there were pickup trucks pulling over along the gravel road that bordered the South 40. Dale Whitmore heard about it by 9:30. He showed up at 10. He parked his green Silverado on the far side of the fence, got out, leaned against the hood with a cup of coffee from the Quick Mart in Marshall, and he looked at what Harlan was doing, and then he started to laugh. Not a big, explosive laugh, a quiet one, the kind that's designed to be heard by the people standing around you. "Lord Almighty," Dale said, loud enough for the dozen or so neighbors gathered along the fence to hear him, "is that a chisel plow?" One of the men near him, a younger farmer named Kenny Stoltz, squinted out at the field. "Looks like something older than that," Kenny said. "It sure does," Dale said, shaking his head slowly. He took a sip of his coffee. "Harlan Oaks pulling a relic across ground that's already dead." He said it almost admiringly, like a man expressing reluctant respect for a foolish decision. "You have to give it to him, he's committed." Someone along the fence chuckled, someone else didn't. Now, what Dale was looking at deserves some explanation, and we'll get there in a moment. But first, let me tell you what happened next. Because what happened next is the kind of thing that, once you've seen it, you don't forget. Harlan's son, a 24-year-old named Dennis Oaks, who'd driven down from Columbia for the weekend to help his father, walked over to the fence. Dennis was young and quick and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. He looked at Dale Whitmore and said, simply and without heat, "He knows what he's doing." Dale smiled. "I'm sure he thinks he does," he said. And then he turned to the men along the fence and said, "What's that ground been yielding? 20 bushels an acre, 22, on a good year." He shook his head. "I'll tell you what, boys, if Harlan Oaks pulls a harvest off that South 40 this fall that covers his operating costs, if he pulls so much as 60 bushels of beans an acre off that hardpan, I will personally pay for dinner at the Cattleman's in Sedalia for every man standing here." There was a moment of quiet. 60 bushels of soybeans per acre was not an unreasonable yield for healthy Missouri ground. For the Oaks South 40, which had been coming in at 18 to 22 bushels in recent years, it was, by every conventional measurement, impossible. A man named Bud Hofstetter, who had farmed the adjacent property for 20 years and knew the creek ground better than most, looked at Dale Whitmore and then looked out at Harlan on his Oliver, working the headland. Bud was a careful man. He didn't say anything. But Dale wasn't finished. "And when he can't," Dale said, his voice going a little quieter now, a little more pointed, "when this doesn't work and that ground doesn't come back, and it won't, I want Harlan to think seriously about what I've offered him." He paused. "That's all. A man ought to be realistic." He finished his coffee, crushed the cup, and tossed it in the bed of his truck. Then he got in, turned the engine over, and let his clean green Silverado roll back down the gravel road toward Marshall. "Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a moment, at work, at school, in a field or a boardroom or a gym, where someone looked at everything you were doing and decided it was worthless before it was finished, before they even understood what it was?" Harlan Oaks heard none of Dale Whitmore's remarks. He was 200 yards out in a field, on a tractor he'd been running since Lyndon Johnson was president, pulling something behind him that he'd spent the better part of 6 months preparing. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew what was coming. Let me tell you what Harlan Oaks knew that almost nobody else in Saline County, Missouri knew in the autumn of 1983. It starts in 1974, 9 years earlier. Harlan had driven, this is important, he drove 17 hours round trip to Rodale Research Center in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. The Rodale Institute, for those who don't know it, was one of the earliest and most serious research institutions dedicated to what we now call regenerative and organic farming. In 1974, most conventional farmers in the Midwest would have described Rodale as a collection of hippies with compost bins. What they actually were was a group of serious scientists and agronomists who were asking a question that the land-grant universities and the USDA weren't paying much attention to yet. What happens to the soil when you stop fighting it? Harlan had read about Rodale's work in a small magazine, not a farm magazine, a general interest magazine, and something had clicked. He'd called them, they'd invited him out, he'd gone. What he found there changed the way he thought about his ground permanently. The core of what Harlan learned over those 2 days in Kutztown, and over the years of correspondence and reading that followed, was this. The problem with his South 40 was not that the soil was dead. It was that the soil was compacted, depleted, and structurally broken by decades of deep mold-board plow tillage. The conventional response to compacted soil in 1983 was more tillage, break it up, turn it over, expose it. But Harlan had come to understand, through Rodale and through his own observation, that this approach was exactly backwards. Every pass with a heavy implement on already stressed soil made the compaction layer, what agronomists call the plow pan, deeper and denser. What the soil actually needed was to be left alone, mostly, and supported. But here's where it gets specific. Here's where Harlan's knowledge became not just philosophical but practical, because he hadn't just read about soil biology. He had, over the course of about 4 years, quietly and without telling many people, been implementing something on 20 acres of his north field that the University of Missouri Extension Service would not formally endorse for another decade. He called it simply putting the worms back. What he had actually done, working from a combination of rodil guidance, a 1979 USDA bulletin on cover cropping that he'd gotten from a soil conservationist named Art Pendergast in Sedalia, and his own careful experimentation, was implement a multi-stage soil restoration protocol that would look, to a modern regenerative farmer, almost exactly right. He had broadcast seeded a mixture of hairy vetch, winter rye, and crimson clover across his north 20 acres in the fall of 1979, then rolled it down in the spring rather than tilling it in. He had spread composted manure, not at the rates a conventional farmer would use fertilizer, but in smaller, more targeted applications. And critically, he had stopped running heavy equipment on that ground when it was wet. That last part sounds simple. It is not simple when you're a working farmer trying to hit planting and harvest windows. The results on the North 20 after 4 years were not dramatic in appearance. The field didn't look spectacular, but the yields had crept up from 38 bushels of beans in 1979 to 52 in 1982 on ground that had been nearly as compromised as the South 40. What he was planning for the South 40 was the same approach but compressed and more urgent, and it required the machine that Dale Whitmore had laughed at. The machine was not, as Dale had guessed, a chisel plow. It was older than that and stranger. It was a 1948 Graham home plow, specifically a noble blade-style subsoiler with a winged foot configuration that Harlan had purchased at an estate auction in Pettis County for $140 in 1981. The Graham home was a mid-century dryland farming implement that worked on a principle almost opposite to the moldboard plow that had dominated American agriculture since John Deere's steel plow in 1837. Instead of inverting the soil, lifting it, turning it, exposing the subsoil, the Graham home swept beneath the surface, shattering the compaction layer at about 14 inches without disturbing the soil profile above. It left the crop residue on top, it left the surface structure intact, it broke the plow pan from underneath. In 1948, this implement was designed to address wind erosion in the dry wheat regions of the Great Plains and Canada. In 1983, in the hands of Harlan Oaks in Saline County, Missouri, it was something else entirely. It was a key. Now, this is where we slow down, because what happened over the next 6 weeks is the kind of thing you have to see in order to believe it, and since we weren't there, we're going to build it together, detail by detail. October 7, 1983. Temperature at dawn, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. There was frost on the windshield of Harlan's pickup, the white kind that goes on in layers overnight and makes the world look draped in gauze. Ruth Ellen had gotten up at 5:30 to start the coffee and to fry eggs, and Harlan had eaten at the kitchen table in the dark, drinking 2 cups of black coffee and looking at a hand-drawn map of the South 40 that he'd sketched on graph paper. He had divided the field into 8 sections. He knew the wet spots, the worst compaction areas, the places where water pooled and suffocated roots. He had flagged them with orange survey stakes in September. He was out in the field by 7. The Oliver 880 was a 66-horsepower tractor, not a large machine by any measure. It had been manufactured in Charles City, Iowa, at the Oliver Corporation's main plant, and in 1983 it was 22 years old. The hydraulic system leaked slightly from the left lift arm. The temperature gauge ran a little hot. The seat had been recovered by Harlan himself with a piece of vinyl he'd bought at the TG&Y in Marshall. The engine, a 265 cubic inch diesel, had been rebuilt by Harlan and his son Dennis in the spring of 1982, and it ran with the steady, slightly rough-edged authority of a working machine that has been properly cared for. He made his first pass across the headland at about 7:15 in the morning. The Graham home sank 14 inches into the Saline County clay and moved through it with a sound, and this is important, the sound like tearing. Not loud, not violent, a low, sustained tearing, the sound of something compressed for years finally being allowed to separate. Behind the implement, the soil surface heaved slightly, not dramatically, not the turned-over, fluffy furrows of a moldboard plow, just a gentle, almost geological lifting. The frost-white soil cracked along the blade's path and then settled, mostly as it had been, but fractured beneath. Harlan made 8 passes before he stopped to check his work. He got off the tractor, walked to the nearest pass line, and knelt in the field. He pushed his hand into the soil. The surface gave immediately, with none of the brick-like resistance it had shown before. He pushed down further. At 10 inches, he felt the shattered layer. It was granular now, not fluffy. Saline County clay doesn't get fluffy, but broken, articulated, the kind of soil that water can move through. He stood up. He walked back to the tractor. He worked until 4 in the afternoon. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you did something that required you to trust a process that you couldn't fully see, to work toward a result that wouldn't be visible for weeks or months, based on principles you'd spent years learning quietly, alone, without applause? That's what October in that field smelled like. It smelled like cold clay and diesel exhaust and something older, the mineral smell of soil that hasn't seen air in a long time. Earthworms, shocked by the sudden fracturing of the compaction layer, came to the surface in numbers that surprised even Harlan. He noted it in the small spiral notebook he kept in his chest pocket. Good worm activity, South Section 3 and 4. Soil breaks well below Flag 2. He broadcast seeded a cover crop mixture, winter rye at 90 pounds per acre, hairy vetch at 20 pounds per acre, across the subsoiled sections as he completed each one. He used a borrowed Gandhi seed box mounted on a toolbar behind the subsoiler. The seed went into the fractured soil with no additional tillage, just dropped into the broken structure and left. Then he broadcast using a tailgate spreader on his old Farmall M, which he kept for light work, aged cattle manure from the pile behind the north barn. Not heavy, approximately 3 tons per acre. He'd been building that manure pile for 2 years specifically for this. Then he waited. Now I need to be precise here, because this is where the drama shifts from what a man does to what the earth does, and the earth does not perform on human timelines. By the 3rd week of October, the rye had germinated. You could see it, a faint green haze across the South 40, almost too subtle to notice from the road. Harlan saw it. He walked the field in the evenings after dinner, sometimes with Ruth Ellen, sometimes alone, and he looked at that green. He didn't say much about it. Ruth Ellen said later that he had the look of a man waiting for a letter he's expecting but afraid to want too much. By the 1st week of November, the rye was 4 inches tall and the hairy vetch was threading through it. The field looked, and this is the only word, alive in a way it hadn't looked in years. Not spectacular, not newsworthy, but alive. Winter came, the ground froze. The cover crop went dormant under a thin layer of snow in January. In February, there was an ice storm that coated the Saline County countryside in a 1/4 inch of clear ice, and the fields looked like glass, and Harlan went to sleep each night trying not to wonder if he'd miscalculated. In March, the rye started growing again before the frost was fully out of the ground. By mid-April, it was knee-high and dense, and the vetch was blooming purple, small, intricate blooms that the honeybees from Bud Hofstadter's hives next door found before Harlan did. On May 2, 1984, Harlan Oakes crimped the cover crop with a weighted rolling basket that he had fabricated himself in the shop over the winter, a design he'd adapted from a description in a 1981 Rodale report. He did not till. He did not plow. He rolled the green biomass flat, leaving it as a mulch layer on the surface of the South 40. 3 days later, he planted soybeans directly into that mat of crimped vegetation, using a John Deere 7000 planter borrowed from his neighbor, Wayne Culbertson, who had drilled it into rows right through the mulch layer at 30-inch spacing. The neighbors who watched thought he had finally lost his mind completely. But then came July. The summer of 1984 was hot and dry in central Missouri, not catastrophically so, but dry enough that the conventional fields in Saline County were showing stress by mid-July. You could see it in the curl of the corn leaves at midday. You could see it in the pale, yellowish tint of soybean fields that were running short on moisture. Harlan's South 40 was green. Not dramatically, cinematically green, but green in the way that a field looks when it has moisture reserves that other fields don't have. The mulch layer had done what a mulch layer does. It had kept the soil surface from crusting, reduced evaporation by 40 to 60% compared to tilled ground, and fed the biology below as it decomposed. The fractured plow pan had allowed the plant roots to go deep, really deep, to find moisture that the shallow-rooted crops in compacted fields couldn't reach. Bud Hofstadter drove past in late July and stopped his truck. He sat there for a long time. He didn't say anything to anyone that day. but that night he called his son-in-law in Sedalia and said, "You might want to come look at something." Harvest came in September of 1984. Harlan hired, or rather, arranged the use of a 1975 John Deere 6600 combine from Wayne Culbertson, who was finished with his own beans by the third week of the month. It was a Tuesday morning, the 25th of September, and the air was warm and gold the way Missouri September mornings can be, the sun at a low angle, the shadows long, the dust from the gravel roads hanging in the light like something out of a painting. Word had gotten around, it always does. By the time Harlan made his first header pass across the South 40, there were 11 vehicles parked along the gravel road. By the time he finished the second round, there were closer to 20. Dale Whitmore showed up at 10:30. He parked his Silverado, got out, and leaned against the hood the way he'd done the previous October. His arms were crossed. His face was composed into the expression of a man who expects to be confirmed in his opinion. The combine worked through the field for 3 hours. The beans were tall, surprisingly tall for a drought-stressed year, and thick-stemmed. The pods were full. Not every field in Saline County was like this. The fields to the north on conventionally worked ground had come in thin. When Harlan finished the field and drove the combine back to the headland, Wayne Culbertson climbed up and pulled the yield monitor data. This was a simple mechanical bushel counter on a 1975 machine, not the digital precision technology we have today. Wayne climbed down and walked to the fence. He was holding a piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the people gathered along the fence. Then he looked at Harlan, who had climbed down from the tractor and was standing with his hat in his hands, looking at his field. 63.5 bushels, Wayne said. Nobody said anything for a moment. 63.5 bushels of soybeans per acre, from ground that had been producing 20, from ground that Dale Whitmore had publicly called dead, in a drought year when the county average would come in at 41 bushels on healthy, conventionally worked ground. That silence. If you've never been in a crowd when something happens that nobody expected, something that shifts the understanding of what's possible, you might not know what it feels like. It's not like movie silence. It's not dramatic. It's just a moment where the air changes, where people stop performing their opinions and just stand there thinking. Bud Hofstadter was the first one to walk over and shake Harlan's hand. He shook it for a long time, both hands, without saying anything. Dale Whitmore uncrossed his arms. He stood up straight. He looked at the field, at the low, crimped mat of cover crop residue at the tractor tracks, at the yield numbers on Wayne's paper that had been passed down the fence line, and were now in the hands of 4 or 5 different men who were reading them with the careful attention of people doing arithmetic. He looked at all of it. He didn't laugh. He got in his truck and drove away. He did not, at any point, say anything about the cattlemen's restaurant in Sedalia. Let me tell you what happened next, because a harvest number, however good, is just a number. What matters is what follows. In the winter of 1984-85, 3 neighboring farmers in Saline County asked Harlan Oaks to walk their fields with them. Not the extension agent, not the John Deere dealer. Harlan, a man with a spiral notebook and a 1948 Graham home plow and 23 years of reading that most of his neighbors hadn't known he was doing. He walked their fields, he looked at their soil, he didn't charge them anything. He told them what he saw and what he thought they might try. By 1986, Wayne Culbertson had stopped running his moldboard plow on his East 40. By 1987, Bud Hofstadter had ordered a subsoiler from a dealer in Columbia and asked Harlan to help him set the shank depth correctly. By 1989, 5 farms in the immediate area around Harlan's property were experimenting in some form with cover cropping, reduced tillage, or both. Art Pendergast, the soil conservationist from Sedalia who had sent Harlan that 1979 USDA bulletin years earlier, drove out to see the South 40 in the spring of 1985. He walked the field with Harlan for 2 hours. He took soil samples. He sent them to the University of Missouri for analysis. The results showed organic matter levels that had increased from 1.1% in 1981. He had a baseline sample from that year to 2.4% by 1985. That is not a small thing. Building organic matter in depleted agricultural soil is slow work. 1% of organic matter in the top 6 inches of an acre of ground represents roughly 2,000 pounds of organic material. To build 1.3% in 4 years under real farm conditions during a drought year was, in Art Pendergast's word, remarkable. Art wrote a short piece about what Harlan had done for a USDA Soil Conservation Service regional newsletter in 1986. He didn't use Harlan's name. Harlan had asked him not to, but the description was specific enough that people who knew the county recognized it. The newsletter reached, eventually, a researcher at the University of Missouri's Division of Plant Sciences named Dr. Carolyn Wick, who was beginning work on what would later be called conservation tillage systems for Missouri row crop production. She called Harlan in the spring of 1987. He talked to her for 45 minutes on the kitchen telephone while Ruth Ellen made pie. He answered every question she had. He referred her to 3 publications she hadn't read. He invited her to walk the South 40. She came in June. She came back in 1988 and 1989. In 1991, Dr. Wick published a paper in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation that cited, among other sources, the field observations from a Saline County farm operation that had demonstrated marked improvement in infiltration rates, organic matter accumulation, and yield stability under reduced input no-till adjacent management systems. She named the farm in the acknowledgments, the Oaks Farm, Marshall, Missouri. Harlan read the acknowledgment sitting at his kitchen table. Ruth Ellen was next to him. He read it twice. Then he set the journal down and drank his coffee. "Well," he said. "Well," Ruth Ellen agreed. Meanwhile, the South 40 in 1987 yielded 71 bushels of soybeans per acre in a normal rainfall year. In 1989, the field was rotated to corn, which came in at 138 bushels per acre, well above the county average of 112. The field that Dale Whitmore had described as dead was, by the end of the decade, the most productive piece of ground on the Oaks farm. The Oaks farm did not go under during the farm crisis. That is worth saying plainly. In a decade when more than 300,000 American farms failed, when 3 of Harlan's immediate neighbors lost their operations, when the landscape of Saline County was permanently altered by foreclosures and consolidation, the Oaks farm survived, not because of luck, not because of a government program. Because a man had spent a decade learning something quietly, preparing for a moment nobody else saw coming, and then executing with the patience and precision that only comes from genuine understanding. Dennis Oaks, Harlan's son, moved back to the farm permanently in 1988. He is still there. The farm has grown from 280 acres to 410 through careful, debt-free acquisitions over the years. The South 40 has never been moldboard plowed again. As for Dale Whitmore, the John Deere dealership in Marshall changed hands in 1992. Dale moved to Kansas City. He is not remembered warmly in Saline County, though he is remembered. I want to leave you with something, not a lecture, just an observation. There's a type of knowledge that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with credentials on a wall or a title on a business card or a new machine with a price tag big enough to intimidate everyone around it. It comes from years of reading things that other people don't read, paying attention to things that other people dismiss, asking questions in rooms where no one else thinks there's a question worth asking. Harlan Oaks didn't win because he was smarter than Dale Whitmore. He won because he had done something that requires a specific kind of courage. He had spent years being wrong in public, years of yields that didn't match his theory, years of practices that his neighbors and his extension agent and his banker found eccentric or quaint or simply baffling, and he had kept going anyway. He kept going because the evidence of his own soil told him he was on the right track, even when the numbers were still catching up. There is a particular arrogance that comes from confusing current knowledge with complete knowledge. Dale Whitmore looked at Harlan's field in 1983 and saw dead ground because every tool and framework he used to evaluate farmland told him it was dead. He wasn't lying. He was using the best measurements available to a man who had stopped looking for better ones. And that is perhaps the most instructive thing about this whole story. Not that Harlan was right and Dale was wrong, but why Harlan was right and Dale was wrong. Harlan was right because he had gone looking, driving 17 hours to Pennsylvania, writing letters to soil scientists, ordering USDA bulletins, spending winter evenings in a barn with a Graham home plow that everyone else had forgotten existed, for knowledge that existed outside the consensus. Not because the consensus was corrupt, but because the consensus was incomplete. That is always true about farming, about medicine, about technology, about how we raise our children and run our businesses and treat the land we've been given. The consensus is always incomplete. The question is whether you're curious enough and patient enough and humble enough to go looking in the places where it hasn't caught up yet. Harlan Oakes farmed the south 40 of his property until 2001, when he turned the operation over to Dennis. He died in 2009 at 77 years old on the farm where his grandfather had broken ground in 1911. At his funeral in Marshall, Art Pendergast stood up and said something that the people in that church have repeated ever since. He said, "Harlan always told me he wasn't fighting the land, he was listening to it. And eventually," Art said, "it started to talk back." Remember that the next time someone tells you what can't be done. Historical context is real. The Rodale Institute, Graham Home Plow, the 1980s Farm Crisis, Saline County, Missouri, the Oliver 880, Cover Cropping Science, and USDA soil conservation research referenced in this script are all real. Characters, names, and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.